Okay, so welcome to the first episode of Free Lunch, a podcast where the Salem Center for Policy folks sit down and discuss some issues that have been present in our center in the past few months, but also things that are in your minds and we want to sort of argue about. Today I'm joined by Steve Rashin, a postdoc fellow with us. He's currently in Massachusetts, but joining us here in Austin soon. And Greg Lusamieri, our philosopher in-house, and also the director of the program for objectivity in thought and enterprise. And sorry, Greg, I always bundle the
I think just objectivity program, we should call it.
Objectivity program, exactly. And finally, Scott Bogus, that directs our program in financial regulation. So, and today, I guess, Steve, we're going to talk about two issues, right? So what do you take the first one?
All right, so we're gonna talk about two issues. The first is big tech, and the second is energy, because these have both been salient issues over.
Scott, you got the energy background.
Perfect. Over the past month. So, who wants to start with big tech?
Well, we had there are just a number of issues that have come up here, right? There's concerns about whether big tech is censoring. We've had a number of events relative to this over the course of the year, over Free Speech Week. Tara Smith and I both gave talks under the auspices of the center about free speech, and I was talking about why I don't think anything that these companies do is properly understood as censorship or a violation of free speech, but that nonetheless there are really important and pressing questions about what constitutes a good speech policy and why in running a broad-based platform where you expect people to discuss ideas, you want to ensure a wide range of opinions can be expressed. So that's one issue that comes up with big tech. But another that's come up more and more recently from a lot of different corners and has been tied in some minds to the censorship issue is are some of these companies too big? Should they be subject to antitrust prosecution? And there was a panel with a few people in that business, that is some former FEC people and people who are lawyers and knowledgeable about that we had a few weeks ago on is big tech too big, and where I take it too big means there should it be broken up. And so those are two connections in which big techs come up. I know I have opinions on both issues. I'm an opponent of antitrust in general, and so certainly an opponent of it being used here. But I'm interested to hear what other people think.
So let me ask you, Greg, to start from with your thoughts on when you say that nothing of this companies have done on the censorship side in the first topic that you brought. What's your rationale behind none of it being a problem in your view?
Well, I don't think any of it's a violation of the right to free speech, whether it's a problem in the sense that we should think it's a bad product or a poor business decision or a sign of a deteriorating culture. That's a second question. I think that question is more complicated. But I think the right to freedom of speech is the right to be free of forcible government interference in your speech, and the right to associate with different people on different terms in different economic relationships, to speak and the things you want and support the speech you want without supporting the speech you don't. And I think that aspect of it, the aspect of association and making deals around what you want to say and what kind of speech you want to support, which includes the ability to boycott or demur from or not support speech you don't want to support, is really crucial to the right of free speech and to the way free speech functions to help people discover the truth. I mean, it's an important decision to say, I don't want to be associated with this. I don't want to be party to this kind of a discussion. I don't want this on my platform. I think that people do that is part of what makes the right to free speech, or it's part of the mechanism by which free speech enables us all to discover the truth and enables us all to have the best ideas surface. So I think one has to be careful about how one does it, but it's a feature of a free speech regime, not a bug, that there'll be cases where people exclude people and withdraw their sanction.
Yeah, generally, I agree with you, and I think if we were talking about something that is a very free market of exchange of ideas, and I have a platform, you have a platform, I don't want some type of discussion in my platform, fine, don't buy my platform, don't come to my product, don't use my product. And that in a sort of like, if we had a very competitive, very free and well working market, that's absolutely true. And I don't know if we're at a point where that is not the reality. And therefore, when Twitter decides to ban such and such from speaking, or former president from participating on it, whether they are violating any particular right that anybody would have on that platform, given that is a company providing a service for free in a particular case, right? What I worry about, and then I'll make a connection to universities, for example. A private university has limits on how, let's say, using private just because it's something that is outside of the public domain, right? A private university has limits in what it can do to constrain speech of a faculty member, for example, of a student on campus and so on. And the reason for that is that they're not government. They're not those speech codes that are disputed in court. Oftentimes, the universities tend to lose when that comes about. Is because there's an interpretation that somehow that institution, even though it's not government, has a role as the public square, as a role in fomenting the discussion, the exchange of ideas, in a way that one can see some of these companies that are, in the middle of a pandemic, the public square gets redefined. What is the public square? Where is the place where people can exchange ideas? So one could take the view, I think a justifiable view, that going in and saying Twitter deciding that Carlos cannot post information about COVID, let's forget about Trump, can be particularly problematic. Can be particularly problematic in the sense that there's a censorship that is being imposed on, especially if it is imposed on us only one set of ideas, right? One direction of ideas. For example, if you are against lockdowns, that was something that has been, I think, a lot more scrutiny on people that have been critical of the public health actions taken in the last year, right? In both Facebook and Twitter. Taking those ideas out, I think is very problematic if those places are the de facto public square that we have right now in our society. So I don't know how to think about that. I don't know what the legality of it. Clearly they're in the as a legal framework, I think they are protected and they've won that battle, right? But as should that be the case, that's where I have some conflict in my mind about that.
I think it's certainly culturally worrying if you get into a place where the major institutions that are the means by which ideas are shared are tilting the table, so to speak, in favor of some views and not others. But then I think that's something to be fought culturally by promoting the ideas there in forms where they'll have them. And it's hard to tell exactly what's happening with companies like Twitter on these things. So they're stopping mostly what I've seen them doing is putting up little blurbs telling you that they fact checked something. And some of that is ham-fisted, but a lot of it I actually appreciate, because I think I still get to see the person's view. I often go, looking for fact checks on views I find, because it's just too good to be true or too bad to be true. Is this, it just fits my narrative or doesn't too well, and I want to know if it's true. And I view it as a feature of the service if they're making it easier for me to find that information. But I get, and I don't think these services were ever or could ever be purely neutral platforms. They were always such that they were amplifying some kinds of signals and not others. And, either by how many people in my friend group like it, or there's always some algorithm that's determining which ones are amplified. It's not as though it's like a bulletin board in the town square and I see whatever the last guy walked by posted on it. So I think it's just part of the service that they're providing, that they're trying to find a better way to put me in touch with the set of information I want. And if that set of information includes fact checks, as it often does for me, I view it as a feature. But in cases where I think they're trying not to let me find out about something, when I ever hear about something like that I'm really concerned about. I think that would be really bad. But the cases I've looked into like that, I found less concerning when I've looked into them than I was at first. And I might be missing some of them, though.
I think there are two big issues. The first is the ubiquity. And it would be less probably if you're going to ban someone from what is de facto like how we communicate now. I think that would be less problematic if there were if there were viable alternatives. Now, this doesn't mean that that there isn't information that, companies shouldn't say, look, we don't want out there. For instance, no one should be out there promoting like horrific human rights abuses. I think we'd all be in favor of saying, like, the Burmese government, for instance, shouldn't be able to promote views that demonize the Rohingya. I think that would be a reasonable, and I think Facebook did get into some trouble with this, but but I do believe that that these platforms, even though they are an effective public square, should be able to ban some really pernicious views. And then the other issue with the public square is that this isn't nightly news in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. It's everyone gets their own particular version of the public square. So when I log into Twitter, I'm going to get a different informational environment than you are. And I think this is sort of this is the problem I have with public square analogy. It's that the information I'm getting is not necessarily the information you're getting. And I don't know how to think about that, because on the one hand, it's great. Like I get to find out about the things I care about, but on the other hand, that could lead to me getting a whole bunch of information that's just factually incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, also, what is a public square? I mean, so we have this analogy to the public square. Are we talking about like Speaker's Corner in the park in London? Or on my view, I'm a radical. I don't think there should be public property. So I don't think there should be a literal square owned by the government that everybody should stand on and talk about. So for me, it's a metaphor. What things are part of the public discourse happening? And then, of course, as Steve says, and even if there was a square in the park, we're not all going to be there on the same day. So we're all hearing different things. And as a result of the speakers we interact with, the places that we go. But when you say like they should be able to ban this and they shouldn't be able to, or rather the certain government shouldn't be able to spread certain information, what's this be able to? I mean, are you saying that you think it would be a good decision on the part of Facebook or Twitter or whatever not to carry that content? Are you saying that the governments of some other nations should clamp down on it or force Twitter not to carry it? Or who's making things able or unable here?
This is a difficult question, right? So I'm thinking of a situation that we all agree is bad. Like we wouldn't want someone advocating genocide on a platform. We wouldn't want those views to spread. So we can all say genocide is really bad and no one should be able to promote it. But then,
although views like that are protected under First Amendment in the U.S., right? You can be part of the Nazi party if you want, and go outside and wear your swastika and advocate for that. That's a legal thing to do here, right?
Yes, but that means the government can't take action against you. Twitter can.
Yes.
And when I say we all, like, I would think that a majority of people wouldn't want to log on to Twitter and see, this, group A is really bad and we should eliminate them. I think that that's, I think, morally wrong, and B, that's terrible for business. But mostly, I think A is the far more important factor.
I'm though mixed on that because I don't want us to. I want it to be the case that those kind of ideas aren't being advocated in my society. I want those ideas to die. I don't want people to be supporting them. On the other hand, if the guy down the street is advocating that kind of stuff, I'm not sure if I prefer to see it or not. I mean, I want to know, it's offensive when I see it. I don't want to look at it. On the other hand, if someone's advocating genocide, I think better off that I know that and want to, get away from that guy and say, then that it happened in quiet. So I don't know whether I prefer that Twitter, hit me to the fact that he's doing this or keep it out of my feed.
Greg, I've got a question for you. And I think I heard you say something, and I'll put it in my own words. You correct me if I say it wrong, but I thought you were advocating for free speech being the right of private entities to restrict free speech.
I wouldn't phrase it that way because I think the freedom of free speech is the right to, speak on your own property, to your own audience, on your own platform, and to contract with people to create platforms, audiences, etc. So if, you don't want to repeat what I say, I don't think you're violating my free speech. And if you, or constraining my free speech, I think you're exercising yours. And if you own Twitter and you won't promote my posts or whatever, I think that's not you constraining my free speech. It's just coming to terms about how we're going to exercise our respective rights to free speech.
So thanks for that clarification. This really helps. And when I think through this as an economist, I look at, big companies, these big tech companies, as having monopolistic properties. Now, I'm also a bit of a hypocrite in that I think markets solve problems better than governments solve problems. And look at Microsoft and Apple back in the day fighting over browsers and fighting over operating systems. They both fared pretty well. I don't think there needed to be antitrust action there. But here, it's a little bit different because big tech really has, in many ways, a monopoly on the speech platforms. And in many ways, they look like state actors. They look like the old broadcasters of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And, look no further than when, former President Trump was banned. I mean, it was so quiet for a large part of the population that it had a material impact, I believe. And so I think it's more than just, well, it's my private property and I don't want to hear it anymore. And I don't think that big tech did themselves any favor with the bans, because if anything, it just demonstrated that they do have monopoly-like power over free speech.
But they were in this, and I think that highlights, Scott, another thing that I think you're right about is that they are too close to government in some ways, right? That one reason I think is undeniable that the censorship that took place was primarily in one side of the aisle versus the other. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they responded to pressure from one side of the aisle more. They know who's coming to power. They know who they need to be more close to right now. And therefore, it's less costly for them, right? Especially given that they know they might be in a position of too large and about to be more regulated and so on. That it puts me in an uncomfortable position. They are too big. There are a lot of regulatory things that are going to come their way, and they're just trying to sort of buy favors from the pressure that government is putting on them as well. And that's disturbing. Again, I think theoretically, I would agree with you when you say that markets would solve those things. And I think that's the view that Greg has, that, those things will sort itself out. Don't interfere. Somebody can create something for those ideas to be, if they are popular and they are in demand, there's a value in the market to create them. And we saw that with Parler, that yes, there was demand for Parler. People want to go into Parler and hear whatever it is that Parler has allowed them to hear in Parler. But then you get the people who run the pipe saying, no, you cannot have it, which is like another layer of like, wait a second, that's not constraining speech and there's really no way to go around that. It's really difficult for them to go around that, right?
Well, they're back up now on another site.
Yes, it took a while, right? And
they could have planned better for it. I mean, I think I'm skeptical that Parler had a coherent strategy here, but it's not. So a few thoughts on this monopoly. First of all, there's Amazon, Facebook, Twitter. Then there's also TikTok. I've just learned in the last few days that there are these political stars on TikTok, and apparently also some evangelical preacher who was on our campus yesterday and gathered these huge crowds because everyone knows her from TikTok, and I think they wanted to make fun of her. But anyway, so there's these other platforms we don't know about now, Clubhouse and so forth. So I don't think it's true that, it is true that they have a huge impact on our lives, but I think there are more of them than we know about. They're changing faster than we might think. And if you think about, is it like the old media networks, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s? Well, there are a couple of really big companies. In that sense, it's similar. But if you think of the range and diversity of viewpoints that we have available to us now, it's way greater than it was in the 60s, 70s, 50s. I mean, they finally let Milton Friedman on PBS and it made a big difference. But, if you look at, people have this idea that Walter Cronkite and the newscasters then were balanced. They weren't balanced. It's just people didn't know of the views that were outside of the narrow band that was on the networks. So it seemed balanced to them. Now we have just a ton of views available to us. And it might be that the market response now is that there's too much fringy stuff. And what the market is doing is correcting for some of that. More people don't want some of that fringy stuff than do. And that's the market operating. Now, I do think with Trump, there's a real worry here about, it's very strange for a major company not to be willing to deal with somebody who was voted for by about half the population, right? There's a weird cultural problem when your country is in a state that it's not some, anti-Semitic shooter on Gab that nobody wants to deal with, but major companies are unwilling to deal with somebody who's supported by that much of the population. But that's, I don't think, a problem with those companies. I think it's a cultural problem that we're in, that we're like really polarized now. And the very fact that there are so many people who do support that president means that there's a lot of economic energy. There's a lot of possibility for alternative platforms to come up. And I'm not at all worried that Trump's not going to be able to get his word out. Maybe, things got unnaturally quiet for a few days or a few weeks. But if he's energetic about getting his word out for good or ill, there's plenty of opportunity and plenty of capital available to make it happen.
So you mentioned capital. Let me ask a question to Scott, I think, which is a good analogy to what we're talking about here. One of the things that happened that I was particularly disturbed by, and was I think it was Stripe, which processed a lot of payments through the internet, said that they would not process payments for political donations, I think, to Trump PACs, okay? So donating money to a campaign is equated to speech in our law, in our system of laws. Okay, so my ability to give money to a candidate is essentially my ability to speak, right? One way I can speak. So again, a bank, forget about being Stripe. Just imagine it's a bank. A bank say, no, I'm not going to process a payment for this thing that has this transfer that you want to make because I don't like those ideas. Is that how do we? Is that okay? Can banks segregate on who to send money from one direction to the other based on their just judgment of whether that's a undesirable view or?
I think this is analog to just kicking somebody off the platform. I think it's the exact analog. It's the same as Amazon not facilitating the infrastructure for Parler. But I differ with Greg here in that I actually do believe that there are public goods, and money transfer and money payment systems like SWIFT and other competing systems are incredibly important. And when those get hijacked and undermine stuff like free speech, that is problematic. And I think it becomes more sensitive here because it does touch the money system more so than Twitter turning off somebody's handle.
Right. So you could get in a situation where, forget about Trump or a bad view. Imagine somebody has a really good view. We have finally a candidate that's a libertarian that has some support in the population. But then, the folks that run the bank said, no, we're not going to let you get any money, any donations, even though you have popular support, but we don't like your views. That would be really bad, right? Even would you think they have the right to say, yeah, no, that's okay. It's their platform. They're the ones managing the transmission of money, and yeah, go figure out a way to transfer the money, another source, it's tough, right?
Well, ultimately, there are going to be some standards for these things. And either the standards are going to be that whatever platforms are available, whether it's for transferring ideas or transferring money, right, decide to take a standpoint of neutrality on them. Or they're going to not, in which case, either people are going to be closed out of being able to do this, or they're going to have to develop alternative networks. And there are alternative networks for transferring money. It's just smaller and a lot more inconvenient and a lot worse, right? But as a society, I think, I would like to see these things be either more neutral in what the central ones promote, or more decentralized. There are lots of different companies. And we can try to support that, I think, by who we patronize insofar as we can and what views we support. But if we have the government control what the standards are, that's the ultimate centralization that doesn't allow for dissenting views and dissenting opinions as to what views ought to be permissible and what shouldn't, or what standards should be used to decide who is and who isn't allowed to transfer things. And this isn't merely theoretical if we imagine some good view, because this is the app that then can't get its word across because of bad policies. This was the case for abolitionism, right? Abolitionism was a radical of slavery, was a radical viewpoint at its time. Abolitionist literature was not allowed to be put through the post office at various times. Likewise for pro-contraceptive literature. And we could say, now, yeah, we wish the post office would carry everything, and it does, and bully for the post office, but and bully for FedEx and other companies that do it. But if it's in the hands of private companies and the main ones make what we think are the wrong decisions on this, it's possible, however difficult, to circumvent them, and possible without going outside the law. But when it's the government that controls it, I don't think it's possible to go outside. And
there's a little bit difference. There's some difference here, because in the examples you gave, the government is restricting the free speech. Here, it's large private enterprise restricting it. So you don't think the government has any role whatsoever in keeping very large private institutions from restricting that free speech?
So what I think is the same is whether it's government or the private individuals that are setting the policies. And I think what the government needs to do is free us to set our own policies. And one way we might do that is through having large companies that do it. So I don't think the issue is restricting, being more or less permissive about what speech can be supported or travel over which media. I think it's the fundamental issue is that decision made politically by government actors, or is it made economically by voluntary transactions among people creating companies and dealing with companies large and small?
I view it more as adhering to First Amendment rights and pointing to the Constitution, which I hope we all can agree to, and whether it's private or government, taking actions that support it.
But the First Amendment's about what you can't violate the First Amendment, right? Even if you want to, it's not about what you can do. And that's true if you're Amazon or Walmart, the same.
No, but that's what makes the point interesting, right? Because I am absolutely free to violate the First Amendment in my private store, right? In my store, if you walk into my store, you're not allowed to say what you want. That's absolutely true, right?
Is that a violation of the First Amendment? I
think in the sense that
not even free to violate it. But.
No, you're not exactly. You're not protected. The First Amendment does not apply to a job. So people say that a lot of times, like, "Oh, I was fired from my job for giving my opinions." Like, you don't have the right for your opinion in your job. That's not. We here at the university, we have this added protection. Courts have decided to extend the First Amendment to us, essentially, right? Again, that was not necessarily the case at first, but courts decided on that we are protected by the First Amendment because of the nature of our job, right? And I think that's the discussion we're having, is that I don't think we all would agree that if you work at a McDonald's, you do not have the First Amendment rights associated with you. But then we're talking about companies that operate in a space that has this sort of public good associated with it, whether it's transfer of money, whether it's transfer of information, and maybe they're too big and they're monopolistic in some ways, which then one can make a reasonable argument that the First Amendment protections applies to that space as well.
And there's a difference between being an employee and not being able to exert your First Amendment rights and a business model that's built up about being an intermediary of communicating your views, right? So that's their business model.
Right.
Well, speaking of public goods, we can obviously keep talking about this, but I wanted to make sure that we got in our discussion on the energy crisis in Texas. So if you
do the transition, could I just notice a difference in how we're thinking about this? Because
yeah,
Carlos and Scott, you're both thinking about it. Where does the First Amendment apply, or where do First Amendment protections apply? And they apply in this case, but not that case, or to this person, but not to that person. I think of it somewhat differently. I think that First Amendment protections apply everywhere. I mean, everywhere within the country. But the question is, what do they imply for this case? So like, I think the McDonald's worker and the McDonald's both have full First Amendment protection, but what that protection is against is the government specifying what can be said and what deals can be made about what can be said. And so when the McDonald's fires somebody for cursing out a customer or whatever he might do that would be against, one might think of as against his First Amendment rights, I think of that as an exercise of the First Amendment. That the McDonald's has the freedom to set that policy, that he has the freedom to contract for a job, under those terms that, where he gives up, he agrees to say certain things and not others in this context. All of that I see is what's made possible with the First Amendment. So there are two ways of thinking about the amendment's role here.
I would separate that because we explicitly have in the Constitution freedom of contract, which is separate from the way what the First Amendment says, which is explicit about that the government shall not interfere in your ability to communicate ideas and religious ideas and so on.
It's contracting over speech, though, right? Like when we agree, it's because we each have freedom of speech and then have freedom of contract that we can contract to speak about various things and not about other things. And
but I think what makes a difference here in this context is that these enterprises have lended themselves to give voices to facilitate this, and we've come to expect it. And whether or not we should have expected it, we did. And now when they took it away, it turned everything upside down. And now we're having this discussion.
Yeah. So there's a question of whether reliance interests or something having become a necessity of life or perceived as a necessity of life changes that.
Right.
Which brings us to energy, I think, really immediately.
Right. Exactly.
That was a beautiful transition.
Thanks for keeping us on task.
Energy, we want to talk a little bit about a few things that we got to discuss since the energy crisis. Well, let's talk about what the crisis was, right? We had this blackout in Texas for a number of days due to a once in a century winter storm that created super cold temperatures across the state of Texas, and our infrastructure wasn't prepared for that in a way that not enough generation was able to be there at a time where there's a lot of demand for power. And we got to this big loss of property, loss of life associated with this blackouts that lasted many days across the state, in some places even up to a week. So we had a few discussions. One of them we're having some people that work on the regulator side and understand those markets, the energy markets in Texas in particular, but also all the way to folks that just think more generically about the energy business and thinking about the ways in which we've been treating energy in the past few years, with the focus on renewables as a way to deal with the vast amounts of carbon dioxide being emitted in the atmosphere, so on and so forth. Anyway, so I learned a bunch from those discussions. I think I encourage anybody to watch some of those discussions that we have in our YouTube channel. But I'll start by just pointing out one thing that to me was very salient throughout the discussion, is that as soon as you have a crisis, there's this notion that there's somebody to be blamed, that there's a problem to be fixed. And as somebody that studies decision making and studies uncertainty, there's absolutely ex ante, perhaps we did everything right, and then something real bad happened because it was either a very small probability event, something that we wouldn't necessarily want to insure against, and it's totally fine, right? Bad things happen, and we're not going to insure ourselves against everything. So that's where I started thinking about this problem. Is that a problem here, or we just saw something that is really dramatically outside of the bounds of what we can expect, and therefore nothing can be done about it? That's what it is. We're all gonna pay a price for that really low probability event. Or is there something that ex ante we could have seen that and it had to be done differently? So I don't know where I fall on that yet, but that's the one thing that I'm still thinking about. What it is. Do we need to do anything, or our system is actually pretty decent as it is, and just move forward and not worry about it?
So I think that the events that the center put on really helped educate me in terms of arriving at the conclusion that this was an extreme event, and there are probably things that could be done to make the next event of this nature less problematic, but it was more of an extreme event than it was any particular policy or system that was in place. It was a learning event. It was, in fact, the most extreme weather event we've had in probably 100 years here. So why should we be surprised that something happened out of the ordinary? And it speaks a lot economically to how much insurance do you want to have to protect against bad events. If you want low cost energy and you don't want to pay for insurance, then you better be prepared to deal with the consequences of something like this. And that calculus may end up changing. But there are two things that I found particularly interesting about this. And one is, to your point, Carlos, the immediate and extreme pressure put on the commissioners and the ERCOT for what they did wrong before any investigation was done, and all of the resignations of the people who knew the situation best, right? So basically you purged anybody who knew how things worked, and then you have nobody left at the top. And the irony is that the only people left are the legislators who are complaining.
They don't know anything about it.
They don't know anything about it, right? So I think that is the knee-jerk reaction that often happens, particularly in government, when there's a problem and you want somebody's head to roll. And I don't think that was particularly thoughtful. And I feel for all the board members. I don't think any one of them are evil or bad people. In fact, Peter Crampton is a world-renowned economist who was at the University of Maryland, and he's the guy, when I was at the SEC, we frequently consulted on how to deal with equity market structure issues, right? And there's like 2 people or 3 people in the world that can do what he does, and now we want him off the board because he doesn't live in Texas because he doesn't have skin in the game. And like, that's just kind of, an outcome that, is not thoughtful. The other thing that I find really interesting about this episode is that people are criticizing that it was the market in terms of not working here, that we shouldn't have a market function. In fact, I think, based on what I've learned so far, is that the failure was actually a human failure, not a market failure. You had 3 commissioners decide that there was no power coming, and they flipped the switch saying, we're going to make it $9,000 per megawatt hour. And no more power came because there was no more power to give. And they left it there at that price, which was not a market price, for 4 days. And people like me, if you had told me that my energy bill was going to go up, I thought I was fortunate in not losing my power. But if you told me my bill was going to go up an order of magnitude, I would have taken the kids into the backyard and built an igloo, and turned the power off. But there was no market function that let me know that it was going to cost me more. And in fact, it was a human error and not a market error in terms of leaving it at such a high price, which really created a huge wealth transfer in the economy that is causing problems now.
Yeah, I think that point in particular is that I think Alex, in one of our discussions made it very clear, is that the notion that we have a market, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's more of a market than a completely regulated market by the government like you have in other regions of the country. It's more of a market. There's more of a system of incentives in place for people to put energy in the market and so on. There's a supply and demand will work to some extent to get us to a price. However, as you said, you have no market signal in your choice of energy use. So, there was if price was a transparent thing that people could see coming their way, well, they would turn the thermostat to 54. And that would be no problem. If everybody had the thermostat at 54, there'll be no problem. But nobody had that signal. That signal was only available to maybe big consumers, and the folks that had contracts through that whatever now infamous company called Greedy, right? They had $36,000 bills sent to people and so on. But the system is such that our bills are fixed, right? Our bills are fixed through the market rate that we contract through a monopoly here, which is the City of Austin Energy Company, which, by the way, made a ton of money. As you mentioned, the transfer part, they made $54 million, I think, in extra revenue because they have a coal plant that, was working throughout the thing, and turns out the prices were really sky high during the time, and they cashed in onto it. The irony here is that they've been trying to close that coal plant because our liberal city council is really upset that we generate coal-powered energy in there through the city of Austin. But it made them $54 million the past month. Anyways, the market
to decommission it.
I know, exactly. The market's not really working there in that sense, right? So that's definitely I would like to see more of a market, not less of a market in this space.
The 2 general points here. I mean, picking up on Alex's point about this not really being a market or it being a sort of market, or I mean, I think it's important to distinguish between free markets in the sense meant by, the kinds of free markets, what are actually free markets, which emerge when people have property rights. The property rights are protected, and then they are free to create whatever contracts they want about exchanging that property. And what we might call exchanges, things like the Obamacare exchanges. Are they free markets? Well, they're kind of market-like. I mean, there's buying and selling going on in it. I guess there are some kind of price signals that could, but the whole thing is kind of set up by a government in order to achieve a certain policy aim. Mm-hmm. And I think, whereas I don't think a real free market is like that. It's not set up by a government to achieve a policy aim. It's what happens when the government keeps regulation out of a certain area. And I think what we have in energy is, exchanges, the basic nature of which is similar to the Obamacare-like exchanges. They're quasi-markets or sub-markets or whatever that are created to advance policy aims. And it's very hard to know with a utility like energy and, what the right legal regime with it is. I don't have it in my back pocket how I think it should be. But in understanding what to make of the kinds of ways we have it, I don't know that you could say that Texas is freer or less free than some other states. The other thought I had on this is, first, I really want to thank you guys, Carlos and Scott. You're some of the very few voices I've heard making this point that maybe nothing was wrong. I mean, obviously lots of things went wrong, but we shouldn't assume because a bad event occurred that we should have invested more in preparing for it. Maybe that's right, but we don't want to assume that ex ante. But there is a reason why I'm skeptical, or I think there's a reason to think that something went wrong that could have been anticipated. But I'm not sure if this is right. And something systemic rather than this plant had this problem or this plant had that problem, or just this one law needs a slight tweak, which is, it seems to me, but it's hard to tell if this is true, that these kind of events, mass events where large regions are left without power for a prolonged period of time, are becoming more common. Now, it's hard to tell because, the newspaper reports bad news and you remember bad recent news more. And I haven't seen a good study about like how many people have been left without power unexpectedly for how long in each decade. But we had long-term blackouts in California just, less than a year ago. We had this issue in Texas. We had a shorter-term blackout problem in Texas a few years ago. That wasn't anything near as bad as this, but it was bad enough that reports got written about what's wrong with our system, and then nothing got changed. And the fact that it's happening in different states at different times, if there really is a phenomenon here, if it's not a coincidence, if it's really increasing over time, makes me think that there's something about the way the energy economy is evolving over time in the country that's making it less reliable or prizing reliability less. And I wonder if that's true. I can think of several things that could be causing that to happen, but I want to know if the fact's real before we start speculating about the causes.
So I can speak to one thing that was discussed in the first session we had that included some folks from the law school, some engineers that I think knew very well about the system that we have in place in Texas. And one comment there was a comment that 10 years ago, once the big investment on renewal start taking place through the subsidies put in place the two sorts of subsidies, and I don't think people realize that necessarily for renewables. One is the fact that you get direct federal money. If you build a wind power plant or a solar power plant, you get direct money from the feds, right? That's direct subsidies that way. But also there's subsidies associated with the fact that the transmission that's necessary in order to connect, the vast space that a wind farm and then a solar plant occupies to the grid is something that has to be paid by somebody. And the state of Texas has paid through the taxpayer basically to support that infrastructure, right? So we created a bunch of transmission infrastructure. I know that Scott goes to Lubbock a lot and he sees that infrastructure in place. The wind farms are amazing in Lubbock. If you haven't seen it, if you haven't been to West Texas, it's impressive the amount of wind farms that we have out there. So that subsidies were put in place. And again, a subsidy is always something to distort a market to some degree. It might be justifiable in one way or another. Again, from my perspective, it's never justifiable, but that's as a choice that we make. But on top of that, one thing that the discussion brought up was a notion that there was a lot of concerns on how much renewables we could put on the grid and manage appropriately the grid, because of the variability of that input. And one of the things that I remember, one of the members that was more pro renewables in the panel saying that, oh, see, there was a lot of concern, but we did great managing it. Okay, we did great managing it. See, ERCOT did a great job managing the basically going from 0 renewables to something like 15%, I think, on the overall generation. But I think at times we have 50% of our energy in Texas actually is generated by renewables these days. So they did a great job integrating it. And I wonder if that management, even though has been okay for the past 10 years in Texas, I wonder if that's something that is just because it's more difficult to manage the fact that some sources are more volatile. We end up getting prone to more of these events of getting to the limit and not having something, and then something gets out of the plan, and then all of a sudden we have a problem. The volatility associated with renewables, without the necessary backing up infrastructure that might be needed, like the insurance of having non-renewable waiting there idle, right, is maybe the reason for that for that set of events that you're talking about, the set of more
and it could be that the types of subsidization involved and the ways that the market is regulated both blunt or blind the kind of signaling that would make clear that that's happening and give people incentives to steer away from that. So that's one hypothesis as to something systemic that could be going on that could be causing this in Texas and California and elsewhere. Another hypothesis, of course, and these could both be true, as to something that could be causing this, is just that there are more severe weather events, perhaps due to global warming or for other reasons. But
that we have data on, and that's not true.
But these, if it is the case that we're losing more power more often, there are certainly theories available as to why, and I'm very sympathetic to the one that you've just enunciated and that Alex and others, Alex Epstein, has been pushing. But and I suspect that's true. But I really I'd like to see a study, and maybe someone knows of one, of is it or is it not the case that power has gotten less reliable? And how is that measured?
Just one thing I said is not true. We promised. We talked about maybe linking to some references on these things. I'll link to references on Bjorn Lornborg that talks a lot about this, and when you talk about like either weather events or fires and so on, there's a lot of focus, as you said, like the media loves to report on those things, but when you look systematically over time, it's just very little indication that has any major shift in the occurrences or probabilities of occurrences and so on in the last few decades, for example.
And I don't know a lot about energy markets, and I don't want to pretend that I do, but I do have views on subsidies and taxes. And I'm probably not as extreme as Carlos on this. I do think that there are cases for subsidies, but only limited cases. There are network externalities and there are infrastructure issues that do require jump-starting, technologies. But generally, governments are pretty bad at picking winners. And the better way, if you want to shift to more renewables and away from coal and other fuels, then taxing the bad behavior is a better way of figuring out what the better behavior is. So I think there's probably some of that. I haven't seen any compelling evidence. Like I'm all for the shift in renewables, and I mean, obviously, you can't have all wind farms and solar because the sun goes down, the wind stops, and I'm famous for saying, well, it's an empirical question, right, on how much you need of each. You learn by doing, and maybe this episode was a learning experience that might reshape how much of each we need and when, and how to configure it, and whether we need insurance, and whether we're going to have Berkshire Hathaway, come and provide that insurance for us. They provide a lot of insurance, but I think overall, I'm very skeptical of the government coming in now and saying, here's going to be the solution. I can almost be certain that we will get to the wrong answer if we let a legislative body decide what it is.
Well, so let me piggyback on the comment about Buffett here. So the proposal on the table, it's a proposal that government would have to choose to do, Buffett says, I will build you a bunch of natural gas plants that will sit there idle and will be used in extreme events. And the cost for you is $3 per household per month. Sounds cheap, right? I don't know, what's your reaction? $3 per household per month. Sounds cheap, but it's not. It's a large, there's a lot of households in Texas, right? It's a lot of money to be paid. And part of that is like, you create something that a lot of in particular, the big consumers of energy in Texas have fought this notion for a long time of paying for capacity, because they don't want, I mean, Tesla doesn't want to pay for capacity when they built a factory in Austin, right? They want to have cheap energy for their production. That's a lot of money for them to pay. So there's a huge cost for, in particular, for big consumers of energy to pay for that insurance. Maybe it's the right thing to do, but I think I agree with you, Scott, that the movement to renewables require that insurance. I don't think until we have battery technology, we're going to have a backstop, right? And if we don't have that price built in, we're thinking that we're doing something that is cheaper and effective when it's not, because it's not going to be available at some moments.
And this, in my mind, this is really a voting issue for Texas citizens, in that, do they want to pay a higher price to make sure they have power when the next polar vortex hits? I mean, that is, like, to me, that is a decision that the population has to make.
Right.
And if they vote 51% yes, that maybe Berkshire Hathaway is not the solution, but then you do put in something in place for those events, but it's not free.
No, it's not free. And that's the final point I want to make on this, which is, again, something I learned in this process, which I didn't really appreciate this, is that the renewables that we have in place, they have zero marginal costs, right? So there's no cost of generate. Once the sun hits and once the wind's blowing, zero marginal cost, right? So that creates, in the market for energy that we have, what does that do? Whenever the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, energy prices go down to zero. They go negative in Texas, okay? Literally go negative. People that have the greedy contracts get checks in the mail sometimes as a result of their contracts, right? So think about what that does for the people that make energy through, let's say, the nuclear power plant or a coal plant or a gas plant. Like, well, their marginal cost is not zero. They cannot produce, right? So that creates a huge imbalance in the market. The fact that you have something that comes in and can have negative, which, again, if that something was reliable, that would be awesome, right? Because then prices will go down for everybody. Problem is that sometimes that thing goes away. And if that thing goes away, and through the years, the existence of that thing made the business of the natural gas plants not be very profitable, well, they're going to divest from that. So somehow somebody has to build in the cost of the lack of availability of those renewables. And that's what this proposal is all about in some ways, right? How much you're willing to pay. The true price, the true cost is not zero, it's not negative, because you need to plan for this. So there's an incompatibility between the market that we have, I think, and the growth in renewables that we're seeing happening in Texas. So that has to be adjusted somehow.
And let's add that, I think it was Scott, you said you're sure that if it's a decision made by politicians, it's not going to be the right result or the best result. But the system we have now is one that was made by politicians, right? I mean, in a sense, everything we have that's political is made by politicians and voters. But it's not like we have a deregulated or a non-regulated energy sector. We have a kind of very particular set of the way energy is regulated. You wouldn't get a system like that where prices are capable of going negative some of the time, and yet there's no way in which those people are paying for their non-availability the rest of the time. Nobody would want to be plugged into something that worked that way unless we had a regulatory system that made that attractive to come about. And the question is, we're in a political situation now, and there's going to have to be some political decision made, whether to stay the same, change, in what way change. And as you say, it's going to have to be 51% of the voters are going to decide one way or another. What I would like to see, if there was a way to do it, what I think a goal should be politically here, is a way to make the widest range of options here available to individual consumers of power, be they commercial or residential. And if there would be a way to opt into different systems or opt out of this system, or Tesla could avoid paying the $3 per household fee, but then it's going to be first to have its power cut when there's a blackout or whatever. If there was a way to create a system like that, alternative grids, I don't know what there are. You have to really know about the industry to come up with
that's making the market better, right? That's back to Carlos's point of, if you can have greater sensitivity to consumption through the pricing mechanism, I think that is better for everybody, because then you get to decide. You don't even have to take it to a vote, right? You can say, here's your menu of options, you self-select, and then the suppliers and transmitters of power will adapt to it. But I think here, this state is being put in a situation of making a huge investment based on this event before having that market mechanism in place. And I don't think people have fully thought through it yet, what that cost is going to be to them. And I think this is the type of thing that, and I think you elect people to make decisions for you, but there are some decisions that are so big that you maybe take it back, or you wait till the next election, or make it a campaign issue before you take action.
Yeah, it's interesting how people have not only the price is not the only thing that they care about in this market, right? Clearly, there's a lot of virtual signaling going on. Like the city of Austin wants to make sure that it buys only a certain percentage of renewables, which is like a weird statement, because if you think about what that means, right? It's not like you buy from the grid only the electricity generated from this plant or that plant. It's one thing, right? So they have contracts, specific contracts with people that to guarantee that. And in fact, one of the things that also learned in this process was that a lot of the wind farms got in trouble because they sell basically contracts. They preempt their revenue by selling contracts to people that want to buy renewables. They feel good about buying renewables. They go ahead and make these contracts, but they understand that they have to guarantee delivery, right? Because otherwise the buyer has to hedge on the market for, let's say, Austin Energy, for example, needs to hedge on the market the existence of the lack of renewables whenever they don't show up. So for the most part, they kind of know when the sun's going to shine and when the wind's going to blow, and how the market varies in terms of the price. But in the event that we saw, what happens is that prices skyrocket to $9,000 a kilowatt hour. In their contracts, because they're not blowing, the wind's not blowing, the wind farms are supposed to be buying kickbacks at that price to fulfill the contracts they had in place, right? So a bunch of them are going bankrupt right now. A bunch of the wind farms are going bankrupt as a result of this, because the contracts they had in place. And there was an article in the Wall Street Journal basically saying that all the wind farms in Texas are going to be owned by Wall Street because they're going to default. All of them are going to default on their debt, and it's going to be owned by banks now. So it's an interesting event. I think there's a lot of financial implications here, Scott, that's going to be interesting to follow up on, to see how everything gets sort of to the next equilibrium before.
It's a good question as to whether that bankrupting is a good result. I mean, it might be that, what ought to happen is a lot of these companies ought to go bankrupt, ought to be reorganized. This infrastructure now exists, and it can provide value, but maybe the kinds of contracts or the kinds of things they had were wrong and need to be renegotiated.
That's a really good observation. Here's a point. I don't really know where I've settled on this myself, but because this $9,000 per megawatt hour was a human decision, and some would call it a human error, the consequences of the $18 billion wealth transfer is huge. People are going bankrupt because of a single, body of three human beings making a decision without consulting anybody else. And, the analog, to me, at the SEC was thinking about what happened after the Madoff scandal. And after Madoff, there was about a $20 billion hole in that Ponzi scheme. And the government spent 10 years trying to make things right and send money back. And even though they knew they couldn't do it perfectly, they made their best effort. And, the PUC lost their chair, and then the temporary chair said, well, this is just too complicated, so we're not going to do anything. Well, to me, that was an $18 billion decision made by a single human being. And I don't know who she talked to. Like, did she call somebody up and said, hey, what should we do here? So I think there's a lot of people out there that are pretty grumpy right now, because if that body had said, well, we're going to put it back down to 1,000 because nothing's happening at 9,000, then they wouldn't be going bankrupt. And that's a different set of circumstances than that company taking actions on their own accord that led to their demise.
Do you see this as more like
as part of
as more like the Madoff issue, where there was a crime and then how to deal with the crime, or would a closer analogy be Lehman or Bear Stearns, where there were decisions made about who and what to bail out that were very consequential? And
so they're different. So Lehman is like thinking about what to do with all these entities now that have failed because they took, quote unquote, bad decisions. And maybe my Madoff example is a bad one, because I don't want to say that this was a crime here. It was not a crime. I think it was a mistake. If we had do-overs, I think it would be done differently. And that very simple do-over would have huge consequences on the financial health of a lot of entities in both directions. And that's what makes this so unusual. And I don't think, and my point was, I don't want to be overly critical of a commissioner who's obviously in a very tough situation, is that it seemed like a very glib decision given the magnitude of the impact. And it seems like that there should be more thought to it. I know it's hard to unwind contracts and so forth, and some people benefited and have touted their gains in their earnings reports and stuff. And it's a tough decision. And this one, I think, is unprecedented. I've never heard of another situation like this, of this magnitude, to point to.
Well, I think that's a good spot to end, in that it says policies have real consequences for real people.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see a lot of follow up on this. So it's going to be fun fun in some ways to watch what happens in the legislature here in Texas, but also there's a lot of implications for the rest of the country as well, right? Because one thing is for sure, we're not going to go away from renewable. That's not going to happen. No matter who gets elected or what body, that's not going to happen in the near term. So the question is managing this and having the right price being charged and so on and so forth. It's going to be hugely important here. You're mute, Craig, sorry.
And maybe there'll be a greater acknowledgement that there's a real cost to renewables in terms of reliability that you need to manage, because I think we've been sort of living in a fantasy land about this. Everyone wants to do something for the environment, or what they perceive as for the environment. They also don't want to spend money. And when we can add something that seems green and not pay more for it, everyone's happy to do it. But when you either get rid of the green thing or pay more, people aren't happy. And so they're not willing to face the question of how much are we willing to pay to be green, either in terms of pay to emit less carbon, that is, either in terms of days without power or in terms of higher electric.
Are you suggesting there is no free lunch?
Or there you go.
There is no free lunch.
It's a great place to stop.
Or for Carlos, what's the trade-off?
That's right. That's right. All right.
Great.
Well, thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of Free Lunch.